Hey y'all, and welcome back to Carbon Scoring, the best place for action figures and comics history. As my loyal viewers know, it's the summer of Spidey, and we've been going through all kinds of Spidey content here on our channel. We've looked at mystery boxes that were filled with all kinds of different Spider-Man figures dating back to the 80s and 90s. We did a great review of the Spider Slayer, the custom Spider Slayer figure that Martin Dallard, one of our Carbon Scoring viewers, sent to us. That thing is absolutely incredible, and if you haven't seen that video, I definitely want you to check it out. And the big project over the summer is we have been going figure by figure through all of Spidey's rogues gallery, all of his friends and foes, and we've been doing it through the lens of comics history. So we've been looking at the different creators throughout Spider-Man's incredible history who produced all these great characters that we love and that now we collect. So it has been a great summer, and it got me to thinking, why do I collect Spider-Man? I mean, what's the purpose of all this? Why, out of all of the things, is it Spider-Man? Why is that my favorite thing? So as I was thinking about it, I reached back into my childhood and I said, well, what are the origins of my love for Spider-Man? I was a kid of the 1970s, and so that means a lot of things, but one of the things it means is that you didn't get to see Spider-Man on TV the way that kids of the 90s and beyond enjoyed. He wasn't one of the super friends. You know, Batman, Aquaman, the Wonder Twins were on TV every Saturday. You could see the Super Friends anytime. We were lucky if we could catch reruns of the 1966-67 Spidey animated series on a VHF channel and, move the rabbit ears around enough to try to get the screen to come in. The only other places that you really saw Spider-Man in motion were the super cheesy 1970s made-for-TV movies starring Nicholas Hammond. Now, hey, look, they were kind of awesome. I mean, anything that had Spider-Man was going to be awesome to me, but let's admit, these weren't the greatest, although we still need a Nicholas Hammond as Spider-Man figure. Honestly, probably the place that I saw Spider-Man the most was on the Electric Company. He didn't talk, but he definitely had that classic Spidey costume. So cheers up for the Electric Company in the 1970s giving us our dose of Spider-Man. So for me, my first real introduction to Spider-Man was in the comics. And the very first Spider-Man comic that I ever read was issue 250, which was a huge battle with the Hobgoblin. Now, this was right at the end of Roger Stern and John Romita Jr.'s run on the title, and they were working to put the pieces together of this incredible Hobgoblin saga that they had been working on for the past several years. And this book had it all. You had the mystery component of who the Hobgoblin was. You had a villain who was in many ways more powerful than Spider-Man. You had Spider-Man at a disadvantage. He had just lost his spider sense a couple of issues before, where the Hobgoblin had used the Green Goblin's old formula and gassed him and taken away his spider sense. So you've already got Pete at a disadvantage, and he's going to have to go battle a foe that's stronger than him. It was an incredible book, and it was beautifully illustrated by John Romita Jr. with inks by Klaus Janson. You can't think of a better introduction to a character than that book. Stan Lee famously said, every comic is somebody's first comic. And for me, Amazing Spider-Man 250 was the greatest introduction that you could possibly imagine. But I was lucky because there were two other Spider-Man titles that were being published at that time, and they were both really great. One was The Spectacular Spider-Man, and it had its own thing going on. That was where you were dealing with the stories of the Black Cat and the romance that she had with Peter Parker and Spider-Man. You were also getting some pretty cool new characters over in that book at the time, like the Answer and the Spot, who still is a really awesome character that definitely deserves an action figure. So that book was great and was kind of hitting its creative peak. At the same time, the other Spidey book that was on the racks was Marvel Team Up. And so that was my introduction to the Marvel Universe at large. There was no other place that I was going to learn about Daredevil and Black Widow and Nick Fury fighting dreadnoughts. I mean, this was a great primer to help you get involved with the rest of the Marvel Universe when you were a young reader just sort of picking up on the titles. So I mentioned those two books. It turns out there was a third Spidey title that was being published at that time, Marvel Tales. So Marvel Tales was a reprint book, and they would cycle through the old Spidey comics, going back to Amazing Fantasy 15 and then running them in order. And they had just recently kind of reset right before I started reading books. And when I picked up the stories, it was right in the early 20s, right when Steve Ditko was hitting his creative prime on the book, where you get the crime master stories and the Green Goblin stories and Spidey, versus the gangsters and all of that incredible plot that he was putting in there. That's the time frame when the Spider Slayer that Martin Made Us Our Custom came from. So I have this really great time frame incubator where I'm reading the main titles, the main Spider-Man titles, and they're terrific creative teams telling fabulous stories. But at the same time, I'm getting a history lesson on where all this came from because I'm reading month to month those great Ditko books that came out in the early 1960s. Just utterly brilliant. Then I get a complete reset because if 250 and 251 were my first Spidey stories, at the end of issue 251, Spidey jets off to go fight in the Secret Wars, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. And then in 252, he comes back with a brand new costume. So here I am, 11 years old, on the cutting edge. I know everything about Spider-Man, and now he's starting over. He's got this black costume, and I'm one of the few kids who knows that that's happening. Plus, it made you feel like you were in something from the very beginning. You are in on those black costume stories, and man, they were great. And of course, that is what led to Venom and everything that we've seen ever since. So you've got this really precious time in Spider-Man history where all of the books are clicking and they're all synergistic and building on each other. And it all came to a head with Amazing Spider-Man Annual number 18, which came out in 1984. So at this point, Ron Frenz is the main artist on Amazing Spider-Man, and so he drew Annual 18. And it was a story called The Scorpion Takes a Bride. It was actually the story of J. Jonah Jameson's wedding, and the Scorpion comes and captures his fiancée. Now, at this point, Ron Frenz is going full Ditko. He has truly shifted his art to pay homage to the master, and his art looks as close as we have seen anything to that point to looking like the Steve Ditko Spider-Man of the early 60s. So how do we put that together? Well, it turns out that annual was scripted by Stan Lee. Now, I have been really tough on Stan on this channel, particularly when it comes to who deserves credit for creating Spider-Man, for creating his Rogues Gallery, for all of those early stories. And listen, I am always going to fall on the side of Steve Ditko. I am always going to lean Ditko when it comes to who was the creative driving force on Spider-Man. But no one would argue that that book would not be the success that it was without the words that Stan was putting in there. Ditko was coming up with the plots. Ditko was creating the visual identity. Ditko was pacing the book. But Ditko did that for a lot of books, and none of them became Spider-Man except the one that was scripted by Stan Lee. So we'll give Stan some credit, and this annual issue 18 in 1984 was really kind of one of Stan's last great comic books. He didn't write it, he just scripted it in the Marvel manner. It was turned into him, but it was all back. It was like he had never lost a step. That snappy dialogue, that understanding of J. Jonah Jameson, that interplay between the characters, it is just a phenomenal comic book. And I have to say, I'm really super proud and excited because I own a couple of the original pages of art from this book. And listen, if there's anybody out there that has some more of those original pages and would like to rob me blind, just hit me up in the comments or send me a message in my email in the description, because I will obviously pay through the nose for any of those. So that was kind of my comic origin with Spider-Man, but what about the action figures? Now, when I was a little kid, I had some Migos. I had the Batmobile, and I can remember my dad not understanding why I would have Spider-Man driving the Batmobile on Christmas morning, but those were lost to the garbage dump long ago. And like most kids in the 70s, I was super into Star Wars. So I had kind of my peak Star Wars action figure time around the time of Empire Strikes Back. And then I switched over and I was way into G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero. Those toys are still some of my absolute favorites, and they hold a place of honor down in my secret lounge with a huge display of my original G.I. Joe toys. And that certainly tied into my comic book reading, because while Amazing Spider-Man number 250 was my very first Spidey comic, G.I. Joe issue 16 was the first comic that I ever read. And so I loved the G.I. Joe cartoon. When it first came on, that first 5-part miniseries that premiered every afternoon, my brother and I taped it on the old VHS tape recorder, and we would rewatch that over and over again until more G.I. Joe cartoons came out. Big fan of the cartoon. But the cartoon doesn't hold a candle to what Larry Hama was doing in the comics. The depth of the characters, the brilliant storytelling, just the whole feel of it, the action with Snake Eyes' origin as a ninja and everything with Storm Shadow, the silent issue, number 21, just could not be stopped. Those were so great. And so my love for comics and my love for toys were really blossoming through G.I. Joe. But what about Spider-Man? Well, like I said, right after my very first issue, he got sent to the Secret Wars with all of the other Marvel heroes. And granted, that comic was really meant just to be a toy tie-in. Mattel wanted a superhero line to fight against DC's superpowers, and Jim Shooter, the editor-in-chief at the time, wrote the story. Certainly the story of Secret Wars has held up far better than the toys, but those toys were still pretty nice. Granted, they were only 5 points of articulation, and a lot of them shared the same sculpts, but that Spider-Man figure was just so thin and muscular and perfect. And then they came out with the black suit figure. Oh man, I mean, I'm totally in heaven. I actually can close my eyes and remember where it was on the pegs at the Kmart in Greer, South Carolina, when I picked it up off the shelves and my grandfather bought it for me. That black suit was just so awesome as an action figure. But then things kind of went dormant. I was a teenager. I was interested in other things. And then when I was in high school, the Marvel Superheroes line came out. They were crap. There's no doubt. And I think everybody that was working with Toy Biz at the time would admit those figures were kind of terrible, but they were real. They were real Marvel superhero figures on store shelves. Yeah, it's true that those figures weren't very good. Thor didn't have a cape. Captain America had this crazy, launching shield projector that came out of his arm. And Spider-Man had the giant barrel chest, which held the mechanism that allowed for a web-pulling action to come up from the center of his chest. They were garbage. And at the same time, this is when Todd McFarlane is drawing Spider-Man. He does not look like John Romita's Spider-Man at this point. But again, these were real toys, and you better believe I scooped them up. Those toys got better, and my freshman year in college was when the first X-Men line came out, and that was an absolute step up as far as sculpt and articulation. Those original X-Men toys that had Cyclops in his X-Factor uniform and Archangel, they were great, and that toy line really is what sprung Toy Biz into the success that they would experience, for the next 2 decades. So I get through college, I get into graduate school, I get back into Star Wars because Power of the Force has come out at this time. But then when I was out of college, the SpiderMan Animated line had kind of morphed into a comic-centric line, which I really liked better. I liked the versions of the action figures that looked much more like their comic counterparts. I was reading Spidey again. As a matter of fact, I had kind of fallen in and out of Spider-Man, as many people do in their late teens and early 20s. And I was at the grocery store back in my hometown. I was in graduate school at the time, but I was back home. It may have been over Thanksgiving or Christmas, and I was at the grocery store. Back when you could actually find a comic book somewhere other than a comic specialty store, I saw issue 400 sitting on the shelves. And that was a beautiful, beautiful issue where Aunt May gently passes away after revealing that she has known all along that Peter Parker was Spider-Man. And she tells him how proud she is of him and that his Uncle Ben would have been proud of him too. I mean, you talk about pulling at the heartstrings. That was, again, a perfect reintroduction to Spider-Man, and I haven't missed an issue since. Since that time, I have been every Wednesday picking up my Spider-Man books. That was the issue that rekindled my love for the character, because it just was so well done and it reminded me about all of the great things that happened. Now, immediately after that was the Clone Saga. So the fact that I could hang in through the Clone Saga and everything with Ben Reilly, I'm a personal big fan of Ben Reilly. Actually had my first letter that I wrote to Amazing Spider-Man was published that was in favor of Ben Reilly as a character. So don't get me wrong, but we can all admit the Clone Saga was pretty whack at that time. So, you know, even then you knew that, man, this was some weird stuff. But it had a great payout with the return of Norman Osborn, so it did have that going for it. So I'm back into comics, I'm back into action figures. It's coming up on the year 2000. You're reading Toy Fair magazine because that was your best source for information about action figures that are coming out. And I see the ads and the articles about SpiderMan Classics. Finally, we're getting an action figure that truly looks like Spider-Man. And not just any Spider-Man. It looks like Todd McFarlane's Spider-Man. It's thin but muscular, and it has over 30 points of articulation. This is it. This is the greatest action figure that's ever going to be made, ever. Maybe it still is. So in 2000, when the SpiderMan Classics line came out, that was it. I was completely sunk. That line then led into Marvel Legends, and the story goes from there. I've been just a huge collector ever since. You can see behind me, I've got these huge Hot Toys figures from the Marvel movies, and now I have a YouTube channel talking about all of these things. So that's the history. But why Spider-Man? What was it about Spider-Man? And I think it was a number of different factors that played in. He wasn't the biggest superhero. You know, he wasn't big and muscular like Captain America. He certainly was no Incredible Hulk. He was somebody that you could relate to. I'm not a very tall guy, and neither was Spidey. I think that was something that I really loved about the character. But it was that underdog nature. It was the fact that no matter what the situation, the odds were stacked against Spidey, and he always found a way to come through. Sometimes he came through with his strength, sometimes he came through with his brains, and sometimes he came through with his heart. And it was that combination of just tenacity and intelligence, along with that underdog nature, that just made me love the character. And I have ever since. I am going to continue making videos about Spider-Man. I'm going to continue buying basically every Spider-Man action figure and comic book that comes out. And I hope that this gives you guys a little bit better insight into why I am the way I am and why this channel is the way it is. If you aren't a subscriber, I'd encourage you to join on board and come hang out with us. We talk about comics and action figures every week, and I can't wait to see you guys in the next video.